At the age of 3 years old, I boarded a plane in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania with my mother and my father and my little sister, and we'd leave the United States for the first time. I'd eventually get off a plane in Cote d'Ivoire, West Africa, where I'd spend a large chunk of my childhood. And this is how I grew up, moving every 2 to 3 years. And I got to see some amazingly beautiful places and interact with some of the best people you could ever hope to have the chance to sit down with. But given the nature of the work that my father did as an international humanitarian, and then me as well, most of these communities that we interacted with either had just recovered from or were going through either a natural or a man-made disaster. Like in Afghanistan, when I was working there, they were, and actually still are to this day, having a lot of active fighting in that area. I spent a lot of time in Rwanda towards the tail end of what's remembered as one of the worst genocides in modern memory. But it's important that we don't look at these communities and only look at those situations that they went through. These communities are so much more than that. These are resilient people. These are mothers and fathers and friends. Guys like Safar, who would come into my yard and cut flowers and build kites and fly them in Afghanistan. And a guy named Jean-Marie, who would sit with me on a street corner in downtown Kigali, and together we'd eat baguette and samosas. And they would tell me their stories, and it would help me to better understand. I'm here to talk with you tonight about a really simple concept that I've seen some amazing results using throughout my life as an international humanitarian, and that's the use of participatory community development. Now, this form of development focuses just as much on dignity and empowerment as it does on project-related outcomes and outputs. And while it was pioneered in the 1950s, it's never really been adopted like traditional top-down development has. And while we've seen a little bit of a resurgence recently, it's really not at the scale or at the depth that we need it to be to see the kind of change that we're shooting for. An easy way for me to think about the difference between these two types of development is whose lens or whose eyes these stories are being told from. Growing up the way I did, I learned at an early age that communication was about exchange. Even something as simple as going and asking somebody where you could catch the bus to get to that next village over first had to start with questions about your health, about their family, how their crops were doing, what village were they from. Maybe you'd pepper in a couple questions about a local soccer club or a rugby club, and you'd give them that space to answer these questions and to share with you some of their stories. And then you'd sit very patiently while they, in turn, asked you a similar series of questions and gave you opportunity to share your stories. And this is how that you showed that you were authentic. After this took place, though, you could then kind of go back to them and say, you know, where do I catch that bus to make it to that next village? And you prayed like crazy the bus hadn't already left for that day and that you could actually make it. But like I said, this is how you showed you were authentic, this exchange. So many international humanitarians that come into these villages, they look at just extracting information. They're there to gather a survey. They're there to do an assessment. They ask a whole lot of questions. They jump into their Land Rover. They drive off. What happens to that information? The community never knows. So having that exchange and building that relationship within these communities is huge. Now, in traditional top-down development, I think of those stories as being told largely through the eyes of the practitioner themselves. It's thoughts like, I came into this village, and I've identified this issue, and I know exactly what steps that these people need to take to get from here to here. And when they get there, that's all on me. I'm taking all that credit. And if they don't, well, maybe they didn't follow the directions that I laid out for them, or maybe I didn't quite relate to them how important some of these things were. Now, community development I think of as being told more through the eyes of the community as a whole, not just as an individual person. These are groups of people that are gathering around an idea and are together communicating as to how they're going to come together to solve these issues. My hope always is that as a practitioner in this type of a role, at most, you're a facilitator. what you're really hoping to do is be a mere mention or a footnote in this type of a story. These stories are and should be about empowered communities that are rallying around a cause because of a change that they want to see in their community for their sons, daughters, neighbors. During my time overseas, I've seen a lot of good development, but I've also seen a lot of bad. And unfortunately, I think I've seen more of the bad. Oftentimes this bad development, I mean, it's bad right from the jump. It starts with the ideas behind this assistance, attitudes that are paternalistic or patronizing, this type of a savior mentality that kind of dooms these programs before they ever even get off the ground. I mean, imagine knowing what someone's problem is and exactly how they should change their lives to fix it without ever having met that person or spent a minute in their community. Yet you're still absolutely sure, and they need to change and get in line with your thinking. This is just so flawed. It strips away communities of their dignity when we should be looking to build communities up and empower them to create long-lasting change. Oftentimes in this type of programming, if there is a participatory element, it's really to tick a box because maybe the grant said they have to have some sort of community participation. And this is what a couple of my friends and I kind of jokingly refer to as facipulation. It's 10% facilitation and 90% manipulation. Conversations and questions are directed in such a way that you really only can arrive at one predetermined outcome, theirs. And I mean, how arrogant and how just disturbing that must be for the community as they are giving their input to see this change that they want to see in their community. And rather than go with that energy, it's redirected to where somebody has already determined you need to focus. I want to think back a little bit to some time that I spent in the country of Myanmar after Cyclone Nargis. Now, Cyclone Nargis was an incredibly devastating storm. Winds hit over 120 miles per hour, and the flooding was extreme. I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives. And the area that was the worst hit by this storm was a spot called the Irrawaddy Delta. And to say that the Irrawaddy Delta was remote or rural would be about the biggest understatement I could ever make. Roads, even at the level of a sand or a gravel road, only existed into the central village of the committee or the central village in that township area. From there, you would have to travel to affected areas, traveling a series of tidal rivers. So we would crawl into these small little wooden boats with a boatman holding a motor over the side into the water to propel us forward, and that's how we got to these communities. And these boatmen had amazing mental maps of these rivers and such a keen sense for when exactly that tide was going to shift to make a stream unnavigable that to this day I'm just still in absolute awe of. And even with these skilled boatmen and our motorized boats, you were looking at hours and hours of hot, humid traveling, sometimes in just a complete downpour to reach these communities. These were some of the most beautiful places and some of the most beautiful people I've ever worked with, but man, were they remote. When a traditional top-down approach to dealing with this issue, some expert, well actually several experts, thought that this would be a great opportunity to import solutions into these communities. So they looked at how they could look at importing things with the use of tractors and improved breeds. And these decisions were made by a guy far away in an office with a nice air condition on the wall and living very comfortably. And at first, things were going great. Crops were being planted. You saw some progress being made. But then it wasn't too long before you saw a tractor sitting in the middle of the field here, and then another one, and another one, and another one. Until no matter where you traveled in the Delta, you couldn't help but see paddy fields littered with these tractors. You see, little things weren't thought of from that office far away, like maintenance, access to repair parts. Forget that, even something as basic as access to fuel. For that year, production was over. That's huge. And there was a lot of uncertainty about what that next year was going to look like as well. And I imagine that little can be more discouraging than having everything taken away from you in a storm or a disaster like that. To have someone come into your community and to give you a sense of hope, and you place your trust in that hope. Only to find out that they didn't actually really think it through too much. They couldn't be bothered to think that through. And to have everything just fall apart all over again. Well, participatory community development took a different approach to the exact same problem. We gathered community members together. We brought together artisans, agriculturalists, shop owners, and local community leaders, and began having conversations about what issues existed in those communities and assigning priorities to them. The Irrawaddy Delta being some of the world's most premier rice-growing area, agriculture was seen as a priority, both for food and for livelihoods for the people. So that's where the community chose to have an investment. But after talking and weighing the various options of tractors or what would maybe be appropriate, they ended up looking at using traditional water buffaloes and ground-driven rice planting equipment that they were familiar with. And these conversations didn't just take place at that one point. These were conversations that happened throughout the program, multiple points, making sure that you were continually getting that feedback. This provided opportunity for the agriculturalists to talk with the shop owners and to tell them what pieces broke most frequently on their equipment so that it could be stocked in the stores. They could talk with the metal workers and tell them about just this tiny little tweak that they could do to a piece of equipment to make it work that much better. Shop owners were able to communicate with agriculturalists to learn about what was going to be harvested soon and when they could expect to see it in the market. And community leaders were able to hear firsthand feedback from these rural communities as to what the ongoing recovery efforts were actually like, and to be able to take that and influence bigger decisions. And these conversations, they took place around meals, small little tables, and an amazingly excessive amount of extremely strong green tea. But they made sure that they took the time. They made sure that they had the conversations. It was easier to have that conversation for an extra 10 minutes than to have something fail because you hadn't talked it through. And this experience has stayed with me. I think the power of participation is so huge. And unfortunately, a lot of participatory programming stops at that planning phase. And don't get me wrong, I love the participatory planning process. Getting a group of people around and talking about what's next is an amazing thing to do. But we need to take this even further. At Tillers International, where I'm currently the executive director, we take this further by engaging with communities through participatory design, where we pull out a historic tool and we invite community to speak into what they love about the tool and what they hate about that tool. And then we use that as a jump-off point to innovate right there with the community, looking at locally sourced materials, and together we build it, test it, break it, and build it back better. And it never fails, no matter how much time we put into thinking through these tools and trying to perfect them. That community will always identify one thing we could have done better, one thing that either culturally or because of their specific geographical area that we need to change that tool that we never would have considered. Let's be honest, one size fits all barely works for ball caps. It definitely does not work for these large issues that we're wrestling with in this world, like food insecurity, access to clean water, homelessness, poverty alleviation. We need to be open to this community input at all levels, from identifying issues to talking about what success looks like, to a big one, and this is a big one, to budgeting, allowing communities to speak into where money that is set aside for their communities will actually go. I can tell you one thing, if we move towards this overseas, we would see a whole lot less Land Cruisers and Land Rovers driving up the villages, because I tell you, those communities do not care about that. That would no longer be getting top priority in a budget. When working with communities, no matter what type of assistance we're providing, whether we're looking at this as an international side or whether we're looking at this right here in our community, when we engage with communities in this process, we're asking them to put their trust in us. We're asking them to put their trust in this process. And we owe it to them to allow them to speak into this and to participate, to help form community-driven solutions. Because how we tell these stories matters. Thank you.